Thank you, Peter. A familiar semantic order of explanation inspired by Frege begins with the distinction between two truth values, true and false. It then seeks to explain what is truth valuable, what can have those truth values, what's expressed by what we can for that reason understand syntactically as declarative sentences in terms of truth or falsity conditions. These are thought of as states of the world that in a distinctive semantic sense make the truth evaluable sentences true or false. For that reason, they're intelligible as what the sentences count as representing. In a suitable semantic metavocabulary, the truth conditions of, or truth evaluable contents expressed by, declarative sentences can take the mathematical form of functions from represented worldly states to the truth values of sentential representings of them. The core task of pragmatics is offering an account of what one is doing in saying or thinking something expressible by the use of declarative sentences. In this semantics first order of explanation, pragmatics is thought of as explanatorily downstream from the representational semantic story. The individual abilities exercised or the social practices engaged in when speakers and thinkers use sentences with truth evaluable contents or meanings are to be understood in terms of truth evaluating practical attitudes. Taking true, in practice treating a sentence as expressing something true, is doxastically accepting it. Taking false, in practice treating a sentence as expressing something false, is doxastically rejecting it. Those doxastic stances or practical attitudes can be manifested publicly by using sentences to perform speech acts of asserting and denying. It follows that what can be asserted or denied, doxastically accepted or rejected, is just what can take truth values. A converse, pragmatics first order of explanation would begin with an account of the practical attitudes of doxastic acceptance and rejection, and seek to understand in terms of them what's said or expressed by the declarative sentences used in the speech acts of assertion or denial that manifest those attitudes publicly. Instead of understanding semantic content representationally in terms of truth, one can look to further essential features of the discursive practices within which performances can have the pragmatic significance of assertions and denials, expressing doxastic practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection. For any autonomous discursive practice, any language game one can play, though one plays no other, must include not only the making of claims, manifesting doxastic acceptance or rejection of them, but also practices of challenging and defending those claims by giving reasons for and against them. So another strategy would be to try to understand what's said or claimed, the contents that can be accepted or rejected doxastically, in terms of those reason relations among claimables, relations of being a reason for or against. The idea would be to proceed in two stages, in understanding semantics in terms of pragmatics, meaning in terms of use. The first stage begins with practices of reasoning, practices of defending and challenging commitments to accept and reject, undertaken in the first instance by performing speech acts of asserting and denying. On the basis of an account of such reasoning practices involving claimings, it would then offer an account of the reason relations among claimables, what can be doxastically accepted or rejected, in virtue of which some claimings can serve as reasons for and against others. The second stage then elaborates a semantic understanding of the contents that can be doxastically accepted or rejected in terms of the roles claimables expressed by declarative sentences can play in those reason relations. The core of such a two-phase pragmatics first semantic explanatory strategy is to use reason relations among claimable contents to mediate between a pragmatic account of what discursive practitioners do in making claims and giving and asking for reasons for them on the one hand, and a semantic account of the claimable contents they assert and deny, defend and challenge by engaging in such practices on the other hand. Here's a sketch of how the first stage of such an account of the path from pragmatics to semantics might go. We can unpack the distinction and relation between practices of reasoning about claimings, doxastic acceptances and rejections, and reason relations among claimable contents into these pieces. First, discursive practices as such involve reasoning. For in addition to accepting and rejecting what's expressed by declarative sentences, interlocutors must be able both to defend and to challenge the rational credentials of those stances or practical attitudes. Second, defending the credentials of a claiming is producing further claimings that provide reasons for the acceptance or rejection being challenged. Challenging the credentials of a claim is producing further claimings that provide reasons against the acceptance or rejection being challenged. Third, if accepting A functions practically as a reason to accept B, then A provides a reason for B. And if accepting A functions practically as a reason to reject B, then A provides a reason against B. Reason relations are relations that one set of claimables stand in to one another, to another, when the first consists of reasons for or against the other. Fourth, we can call these reason relations implication and incompatibility. To give a reason for is to commit oneself to accept premises that imply the claimable a reason is being given for. To give a reason against is to commit oneself to accept premises that are incompatible with the claimable a reason is being given against. Now here, we're concerned with rational implications, not specifically logical implications. This is the sense in which Pedro is a donkey implies Pedro is a mammal, because the goodness of that implication depends on the contents of the non-logical concepts donkey and mammal, rather than solely on the contents of logical concepts, such as those expressed by conditionals and negation. Wilfrid Sellars calls these materially good implications. A promising direction in which such an account might be deepened and extended is suggested by Greg Restall's and David Ripley's bilateralist normative pragmatic analysis of implication relations. They suggest that we understand the implication statement, gamma implies A, as saying that the position in which one is committed to accept all the elements of gamma and reject the conclusion A is normatively out of bounds. This philosophically powerful pragmatic interpretation allows them to understand sequent calculi as consisting of rules that tell us that if some positions are out of bounds, then some others are also. It's a scorekeeping account. This bilateralist reading of implication understands the role of reason relations to be articulating norms that govern the adoption of practical doxastic attitudes of acceptance and rejection. They guide and constrain what interlocutors do by dividing constellations of attitudes into those that are appropriate and inappropriate. They're in bounds and out of bounds, rather than by issuing imperatives that determine at any point what one must do. The normative pragmatic role of reason relations of implication and incompatibility can be further elaborated by thinking about reasoning practices in terms of commitments and entitlements. Here, the basic claim is that to be intelligible as practices of reasoning, in the sense of accepting and rejecting claimables and defending and challenging those stances with reasons for and against them, the participants in such practices must be understood as keeping track of two different sorts of normative status: the kind of commitment one undertakes or acknowledges in accepting or rejecting a claimable by asserting or denying a sentence expressing it, and the sort of entitlement to that status or practical attitude that's at issue when reasons are offered for or against it. Accepting or rejecting a claimable, paradigmatically by asserting or denying it, is taking a stand on it, adopting a stance towards it. It's committing oneself with respect to it in the way that one would by saying yay or nay to it in response to a suitable yes or no question. What difference does it then make whether an interlocutor can offer reasons to accept what he's accepted or to reject what he's rejected. The commitments involved, the stances taken up, the attitudes adopted are the same either way. But it's also an integral feature of specifically doxastic commitments that one's entitlement to those commitments is always potentially at issue. For in taking up a doxastic stance, one renders oneself liable to demands for justification, for exhibition of reasons to accept or reject the claim that one has accepted or rejected. One may be challenged to show that the position one has adopted is normatively appropriate, in bounds, a commitment one was entitled to adopt. Reasons matter because other practitioners must distinguish between the acceptances and rejections the speaker in question is entitled to in virtue of having reasons to adopt those attitudes, and those the speaker is not entitled to because unable to defend those commitments by offering reasons when suitably challenged to do so. It follows that for each interlocutor, there must be not only a difference between the attitudes, the commitments he's adopted, and those he is not, but also within those he has adopted, between those he's entitled to or justified in, has rational credentials for, and those that are mere commitments, bare of such accompanying entitlements. In making it explicit, I argue that part of what turns practically on one's entitlement or justification, the second person correlate of the first person responsibility to defend one's commitments when one's entitlement is suitably challenged, is the testimonial authority of one's act, its capacity to license others to adopt a corresponding attitude. The essential point is that in addition to the committive dimension of assertional practice, there's a critical dimension, the aspect of the practice in which the rational propriety of those commitments, their justificatory status, is assessed. I implicitly invoked this dimension of entitlement earlier when I talked about defending and challenging the credentials of those commitments. Sorry, I'm going to pull my curtain. Restall-Ripley bilateralism explains implication in terms of a single pragmatic normative status, a constellation of acceptances and rejections being in bounds or contrastively out of bounds, appropriate or inappropriate, okay or not okay. Distinguishing the two normative statuses of commitment and entitlement and their contrasting statuses permits us to discern further fine structure. In these terms, to say that a constellation of acceptances and rejections is out of bounds is to say that it's a collection of commitments to which one cannot be jointly entitled. In terms of commitments and entitlements, we can lay alongside their analysis of implication the analysis of incompatibility that I offer in making it explicit. Two commitments are incompatible when commitment to one precludes entitlement to the other. Ryan Simonelli has nicely synthesized this understanding of incompatibility with the Restall-Ripley understanding of implication in these definitions. Gamma implies A, just in case commitment to accept everything in the premise set gamma precludes entitlement to reject A. And gamma is incompatible with, rules out A, just in case commitment to accept everything in premise set gamma precludes entitlement to accept A. Like the original normative pragmatic bilateral account of implication, these principles make explicit what it is that practitioners need to do in order thereby practically to be taking or treating some claimables to imply or be incompatible with others. They need to take or treat some commitments as precluding entitlement to others in keeping deontic score on their own and others' normative statuses. This more articulated bilateral account of the normative pragmatic functional roles that relations among the acceptables or rejectables expressed by declarative sentences must play in order for them to count as reason relations of implication and incompatibility can be connected to the prior discussion of how such reason relations are intelligible as providing reasons for and against commitments in practices of defending and challenging them by the following principles. Nope, that's not the ones I want. Still not. Okay, sorry. Any set of commitments that precludes entitlement to reject A, thereby implicitly commits one to accept A. And any set of commitments that precludes entitlement to accept A, thereby implicitly commits one to reject A. We can think of these principles as codifying definitions of a concept of some commitments being implicit in others. In the case of implication, they're implicit in it in the literal sense of being implied by a premise set. Here, that fundamental, etymologically natural notion of implicitness is being extended to include reason relations of incompatibility on the basis of the pragmatic definitions of implication and incompatibility that show them to be two species of one genus, namely a set of commitments precluding a set of entitlements. On this account, a reason against a rejection is an implication of acceptance of that conclusion, since gamma implies A says that commitment to all of gamma precludes entitlement to reject A. That's implicitly a reason for acceptance. And dually, an incompatibility exhibits its premises gamma as providing both a reason against acceptance and so implicitly a reason for rejection. All these principles outline an order of explanation that begins with a characterization of practices of making claims and defending and challenging them, and ends with a specification of the functional role relations among the contents that are accepted or rejected, defended and challenged, must play in order properly to be understood as relations of implication and incompatibility among those claimables. This is the first step in a two-stage pragmatics first strategy for understanding semantic content in terms of reason relations. The second step is then to show how to understand the semantic contents of the declarative sentences used to assert and deny in terms of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility among the claimables. I turn next to that task. The idea is that once we have an understanding from the side of pragmatics of the fundamental pair of opposite but complementary reason relations, implication and incompatibility, it'll be possible to use them to formulate a semantic theory, explicating the acceptables, rejectables expressed by declarative sentences. Understanding what can be doxastically accepted or rejected in terms of the roles declarative sentences can play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility would provide a purely pragmatic explication of a fundamental semantic concept, the concept of the contents expressed by those declarative sentences. What I want to do next is to explore two contributions to this enterprise that are made by recent work by two other members of our research on logical expressivism, ROLE, working group. I've already mentioned Ryan Simonelli. I'm now going to talk about Ulf Lobel, who you've just heard from, and Dan Kaplan's work. Lobel offers an illuminating perspective on the relations between a pragmatic story along the lines I've been telling here and the best contemporary work in formal semantics. Kaplan shows in detail how a proper semantic account of the contents expressed by declarative sentences can be elaborated from the role those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. One of the most sophisticated, flexible, and expressively powerful formal semantic understandings of conceptual content available today is Kit Fine's Truthmaker semantics. It's built on a space of what he calls states. We're invited to think of the states as facts or situations, but the notion is an adaptable one, sufficiently general to include whatever it is that we might think of as making declarative sentences true or false. A subset of the space of states is distinguished as the possible states. The only structure imposed on the state space is a partial ordering of parthood. Some states are parts of others. It's assumed that every subset of the space has a least upper bound. It can be thought of as the fusion of the elements of the subset, the unique whole of which they're all parts. The proposition expressed by a sentence A is then specified bilaterally as a pair of sets of states, those verifying states that would make it true and those falsifying states that would make it false. Like intentional semantics, appealing to possible worlds, Truthmaker semantics advances from the fundamental opposition of truth and falsity to a notion of content as truth conditions. It's more general in including also a notion of falsity conditions, which are not assumed in general to be uniformly computable from the truth conditions. Its basic notion of a state is more capacious than that of a possible world, though we can define possible worlds in this framework too. Further flexibility in the form of hyperintentionality is secured by not restricting the state space to possible states, but embedding those possible states in a larger structure that includes multiple distinct impossible ones. In addition, the mereological structure of the state space provides expressive resources in the Truthmaker's semantic metavocabulary that have no analog in classical possible world semantics. The bilateral conception of content, including falsifiers as well as verifiers, and not assuming that either sort of semantic interpretant can straightforwardly be computed from the other, turns out to pay large expressive dividends. The Truthmaker semantic framework permits various definitions of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility. A state T counts as incompatible with a state S, with a set S of states, just in case the fusion of it with all the states in S is an impossible state. We can then say that gamma is incompatible with A, just in case any fusion of verifiers of all the members of gamma with any verifier of A is an impossible state. On the side of implication, there are a number of different notions of semantic consequence definable in the Truthmaker setting, and Fine considers it a signal virtue of his approach that it can express and compare such a variety of senses of follows from. For instance, gamma verifier entails A, in case every state that verifies all the sentences of gamma verifies A. Ulf Lobel shows how the Truthmaker framework allows the definition of a further notion of implication, which Fine does not consider. We can say that gamma implies A if and only if any fusion of a state that verifies all the members of gamma with a state that falsifies all the members of delta is an impossible state. Lobel invites us to compare this semantic notion of multi-succedent implication with Restall and Ripley's bilateral pragmatic notion. Recall that they understand gamma to imply delta if and only if any position that includes accepting all of gamma and rejecting all of delta is normatively incoherent or out of bounds. As we've read it, one cannot be entitled to such a constellation of commitments. Both conceptions can be thought of as stemming from the same intuition that led C.I. Lewis to define his notion of strict implication by saying that in his sense of implies, A implies B in case it's impossible for A to be true and B to be false. That's just the strengthening by necessitation of the horseshoe of bivalent classical logic. Now it's clear that this Truthmaker and Restall Ripley are isomorphic understandings of implication. The role played in the Truthmaker's semantic definition by verifiers and falsifiers of sentences is played in the bilateral pragmatic definition by practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection of sentences, and the role played in the truth-maker's semantic definition by the impossibility of the state that results from fusing those verifiers and falsifiers is played in the bilateral pragmatic definition by the normative incoherence, or out-of-boundness, of the position that results from the concomitant commitment to those acceptances and rejections. I believe the isomorphism of the definitions between definitions of reason relations of implication and incompatibility in the bilateral semantic framework of verifiers and falsifiers and the bilateral pragmatic framework of acceptance and rejection, which Lobel has worked out in detail, is deep and revealing. To begin with, it shows how the connection between two paired truth values and two paired doxastic attitudes, expressed in the principles that accepting is taking true and rejecting is taking false, is reflected and can be further elaborated at the level of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility that articulate the contents that can be true or taken true and false or taken false. In particular, substantial new light is shed on what one must do to count thereby as adopting a practical attitude of taking some claimable to be true or false, when those attitudes are situated in the wider context of practices of giving reasons for and against claimables that are constrained by reason relations of implication and incompatibility. The isomorphic relation between what's expressed by semantic metavocabularies of truth makers and false makers and what's expressed by pragmatic metavocabularies of bilateral commitments and preclusions of entitlements clarifies the relations between what one is saying and what one must be doing in order to say that in using the object language those semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies address. In practically acknowledging that commitment to accept some claimables precludes entitlement to reject others and to accept still others, practitioners are, we can now see, thereby taking it that the fusion of verifiers of the premises and falsifiers, or respectively verifiers, of the conclusions are impossible states. Alethic modal relations of possibility and impossibility and necessity are part of the essential structure of the worldly states and situations that, according to the truth-maker's semantic model, make claimables true or false, and so are what is represented and talked of or thought about by the use of declarative sentences. Deontic normative relations of commitment, entitlement, and preclusion of entitlement are part of the essential structure of discursive practical attitudes, adoption of which, according to the pragmatics first model, is what practitioners must do in order thereby to count as taking or treating what is expressed by declarative sentences as true or false, thereby representing the world as being some ways and not others by saying or thinking that things are thus and so. The very same reason relations of implication and incompatibility, which articulate the claimable contents expressed by declarative sentences, but can both be true or false and be practically taken to be true or false by affirming or denying them, can be construed equally and isomorphically, both semantically in alethic modal terms of making true or false, and pragmatically in deontic normative terms of the practical doxastic attitudes of taking true or false, accepting or rejecting. In a spirit of trust, I attribute a view recognizably of this shape to Hegel, under the rubric bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. Hegel emphasizes reason relations of material incompatibility, Aristotelian contrariety, over those of implication or material consequence, that is, his notion of determinate negation over his notion of mediation, though both of them are always in play. As I read him, Hegel begins with the thought that ways the world can objectively be, facts, are determinate just insofar as they exclude and entail one another in a way properly expressed in alethic modal terms. That the coin is copper makes it impossible that it remains solid at 1100 degrees Celsius and necessitates its being an electrical conductor. By contrast, our subjective takings of the world to be some way, thoughts, are determinate just insofar as they exclude and entail one another in a way properly expressed in deontic normative terms. As I've suggested here that we put this point, my commitment to the coins being copper precludes entitlement to accepting that it would remain solid at 1100 degrees Celsius and precludes entitlement to rejecting that it's an electrical conductor. The point is that one and the same determinate conceptual content, that the coin is copper, can take two forms. An objective one in which it's understood as articulated by relations of exclusion and consequence construed in the alethic modal vocabulary, proper to the expression of laws of nature, and a subjective one in which it's understood as articulated by relations of exclusion and consequence construed in the deontic normative vocabulary, proper to the expression of discursive practices. This is why I use the term bimodal hylomorphism. The view, because it's two modal forms of one content. The view is properly denominated conceptual realism because the very same conceptual content to which we adopt attitudes in thought is understood as present, albeit in a different form, in the objective world that's thought about. The world is accordingly construed as essentially always already in a thinkable state or shape. The isomorphism that Lobel has worked out between Restall and Ripley's normative, pragmatic, bilateral construal of implication and incompatibility relations and a version of Fine's truthmaker semantics is a colorable contemporary development of a thought cognate to what I've called bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism and attributed to Hegel. It suggests how something like this thought can be worked out in detail, for it maps onto one another a semantic idiom of great power and flexibility and a pragmatic idiom that has shown its substantial utility, for instance, in understanding sequent calculi. Each has been used to characterize the fine structure of reason relations in actual applications to multifarious different object vocabularies. Now, when I introduced the idea of a pragmatics first order of explanation, which would start with practices of accepting and rejecting and giving and asking for reasons entitling one to adopt those attitudes, so challenging and defending doxastic commitments, I held out the prospect of a recognizably semantic understanding of the claimables that can be accepted or rejected, taken to be true or false, made available in terms of the reason relations of implication and incompatibility those claimables stand into one another. We've seen how such reason relations can be understood in normative pragmatic terms of commitment and preclusion of entitlement, and how those very same reason relations can be reconstructed in paradigmatically semantic terms of worldly states or situations taken to make claimables true or false. But although the truthmaker semantics underwrites both a notion of the content expressed by declarative sentences and reason relations of implication and incompatibility that can be understood in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary, the truthmaker semantics does not explain truth evaluable content by appeal to those reason relations. Rather, it explains both in terms of the modalized spaces of worldly states verifying and falsifying claimables. Striking as the isomorphism is that Lobel points out between truthmaker semantic construals of implication and incompatibility and normative pragmatic construals of them, it does not amount to an explanation of claimable contents by means of the reason relations that I've suggested we think of as mediating between the pragmatics and the semantics. So it doesn't by itself count as redeeming the promissory note I issued on behalf of a pragmatics first order of semantic explanation. To do that, we can look to the implicational phase space semantics developed by Dan Kaplan, a Pittsburgh member of our role logic working group. It implements precisely what I've been promising, an understanding of what's expressed by declarative sentences in terms of the role those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. In so doing, it fulfills the defining aspiration of the philosophical tradition I call Semantic Inferentialism. It begins with what I regard as a remarkable conceptual innovation. Not only are the semantic interpretants it appeals to, implications and incompatibilities, but so is what's interpreted. That is, the principal and original bearers of semantic significance are construed not as sentences, but as themselves implications. The points of an implicational phase space are candidate implications. Defined on a language thought of as a set of logically atomic sentences. The candidate implications are then all ordered pairs of sets of sentences of the language. They're what I've been representing by statements formed using the snake turnstile. Gamma implies delta. This is the sort of thing manipulated in proof-theoretic multi-succedent sequent calculi and given normative pragmatic interpretations by Restall-Ripley bilateralism. I call the points of the implicational phase space candidate implications because they don't represent just good implications, just candidates for that status. The good implications, the ones that actually hold, intuitively, where the set on the right-hand side taken disjunctively is a genuine consequence of the set of premises on the left-hand side taken conjunctively, are marked as members of a distinguished subspace, I, of good implications. The third element of an implicational phase space semantic model for a language L0, in addition to the space of candidate implication points and the subspace of good implications, I, is an operation of adjunction of candidate implications. To adjoin two candidate implications, one produces a third candidate implication by combining, in the sense of unioning, their premises and combining, in the sense of unioning, their conclusions. With the minimal candidate implication, the ordered pair of the empty set and the empty set, playing the role of an identity element, adjunction is a commutative monoid on the space L cross L. Each candidate implication can now be assigned as its semantic interpretant the set of candidate implications whose adjunctions with it yield good implications, implications in the distinguished set I. The V set of a candidate implication, gamma delta, is what you need to add to it, adjoin to it, to get a good implication. If gamma delta is already a good implication, if it's in the distinguished set I, that fact will be marked by the fact that the minimum candidate implication, the pair of the empty set and the empty set, will be in its V set. If gamma delta is a good implication, its V set is something like its range of subjunctive robustness. Focusing for simplicity just on the premise set, gamma, the V set is telling us what further collateral premises we can add to it without infirming the implication. That is, without turning it from a good one to a bad one. If the hungry lioness sees a limping gazelle nearby, then she will pursue it. That implication would still be good, even if the beetle on a distant tree climbs a bit further out on the branch it's sitting on. But it would not be good if the lioness were suddenly struck by lightning. And the V set codifies the difference between the additional premises that would not infirm the implication and those that would. If the candidate implication is not a good one, its V set tells us what we would need to add, to adjoin to it, to make it a good one. Intuitively, the gamma sets play a role with respect to implications that's analogous to the role played by truth conditions with respect to sentences. They both specify what it would take for one to be semantically good in the different ways in which implications and sentences can be semantically good. At a second stage, a second separate stage, this semantic interpretation of sets of implications by sets of implications by their V sets, can then be extended to specify the semantic roles played by sentences in implications and incompatibilities, rather than just of the implications themselves. In this implications first inferentialist setting, a sentence A can be represented for semantic purposes by a pair of implications. The pair A empty set and empty set A. The semantic content expressed by the sentence, in the sense of its role in reason relations of implication and incompatibility, can then be represented by the V sets of these paired implications. So the V set of the implication A implies empty set determines the set of all the good implications in which A figures as a premise. And correspondingly, the V set of the ordered pair empty set A determines the set of all the good implications in which A figures as a conclusion. For each tells us what additions to the bare skeletons of A empty set and empty set A yield good implications. The nature of the adjunction operation, in terms of which, together with the set of good implications I, the V sets are defined, ensures that A appears as a premise in every element of the set of good implications that results from adjoining elements of its V set to A empty set, and as a conclusion to every element of the set of good implications that results from adjoining elements of its V set to empty set A. The claim is that broadly inferential roles, in the sense specified by pairs of premissory and conclusory V sets, are a good representation of what one must grasp in order to understand what one is accepting or rejecting in undertaking doxastic commitments. For its inferential roles in this sense that determine what's a reason for and against the claims to which one is committing oneself, and so what it would take to entitle oneself to those attitudes and the acts of affirmation and denial that overtly manifest them. For that reason, these are good semantic representations of the claimable contents expressed by declarative sentences. Of course, the idea is not that in order to defend and challenge doxastic commitments, we need to have fully mastered the intricacies of these inferential roles. It is that insofar as we do not, we don't really know what we're committing ourselves to, do not fully understand what we're accepting or rejecting, or the reasons we give entitling us to do so. A minimum criterion of adequacy for Kaplan's implicational phase space semantics is that it can be shown to offer a tractable semantics for the logically complex sentences that result when we extend the logically atomic language L0 by introducing sentential logical vocabulary according to a wide variety of sequent roles. Indeed, Kaplan proves the soundness and completeness results using the implicational phase space semantics for a large number of such logics, including not only classical and intuitionistic logics, but of particular importance to our logic group, a wide variety of substructural logics, non-monotonic, non-transitive, non-contractive logics. This broadly inferentialist semantic account of the claimable, that is acceptable or rejectable contents expressed by declarative sentences, is what I had in mind when I initially raised the possibility that a pragmatics first approach that understands reason relations of implication and incompatibility in normative terms of what one is doing in adopting doxastic practical attitudes of accepting and rejecting claims and challenging and defending entitlement to the resulting commitments by offering reasons for and against them could be built on, extended, and developed to provide an adequate semantics. I've gestured at two routes to semantics. I've described how Lobel offers a way of understanding his version of reason relations, paradigmatically implication, in Fine's truthmaker semantics, in terms of an isomorphism with Restall and Ripley's bilateralist normative pragmatics. And I've explained in general terms how Kaplan defines his implicational phase space semantics directly in terms of implication and incompatibility relations, which we've seen can be understood in normative pragmatic terms of acceptance and rejection, commitments, and preclusions of entitlement. I want to close by comparing and contrasting the reconstruction of reason relations of implication and incompatibility that are offered by these two semantic approaches, that is, in terms of truth makers and in terms of implications. The first thing to appreciate is the strong formal analogies between the two frameworks. The modalized state spaces of truthmaker semantics are built on sets of states that are not further specified. The states making up these spaces could be pretty much anything, which of course contributes greatly to the flexibility of the apparatus. Within the set S of states, a privileged subset of good ones, what Fine refers to as S diamond, is distinguished intuitively by its alethic modal status as possible. Kaplan's implicational phase spaces are sets of points that have more structure than Fine's states. They're candidate implications, pairs of sets of sentences drawn from an antecedent pre-logical language. Within this space, L0 cross L0 of implications, a privileged subset of good ones, I0, is distinguished intuitively by its normative status as codifying the proper implications, what really follows from what. The operations on states or candidate implications, Fine's fusion and Dan Kaplan's adjunction, the one stipulated, the other defined in terms of the additional structure of the space of candidate implications defined on L0, are algebraically both commutative monoids. The semantic interpretants of sentences are in both cases bilateral, verifiers and falsifiers in Fine's case, and premissory and conclusory V sets in Kaplan's case. And there's also a substantial formal difference between the two settings. In the truthmaker framework, the modalized state space with its fusion operation, or the part-whole relation among states, is wholly distinct from the language it's used to interpret semantically. To get a semantic model, Fine requires a third element, an interpretation function that maps sentences of the language onto pairs of sets of verifying and falsifying states. In Kaplan's implicational phase space framework, there's nothing corresponding to this extra element that connects and mediates between the language and the space in which it's interpreted. The extra structure that the points of the implicational phase space come with, there being candidate implications in the form of pairs of sets of sentences of the language, not only means that the monoidal operation of adjunction of candidate implications can be explicitly defined set theoretically. Fine has to simply stipulate his, as opposed to being stipulated the way Fine does with the fusion of states. Because the sentences themselves are already present in the space from which semantic interpretants are drawn, the V functions that semantically interpret first implications and then sentences can also be explicitly defined set theoretically from the raw materials already present in the implicational phase space itself. In this sense, the interpretation function connecting sentences to their semantic interpretants is intrinsic to the sentences as they figure in the space of implications. The sentences come already interpreted by the reason relations they stand in to one another, the roles they play in implications and incompatibilities. All the semantic framework does is to draw that intrinsic interpretation out explicitly. Now, whether this is a virtue or a vice, a benefit or a cost, will depend on collateral theoretical commitments. For one might see it as showing that the implicational phase space framework is foolishly trying to do without relations to extralinguistic reality that are what truthmaker semantic, or what make truthmaker semantics a genuine semantics in the first place. I'm not going to argue about that, but I do want to assemble some further considerations that might bear on such a dispute. For in spite of the substantial difference in the conceptions of semantic interpretation that animate the two different approaches, the fact that both take the mathematical form of commutative monoids plus distinguished subspaces means that their treatment of the crucial reason relations of implication and incompatibility share enough structure to be intertranslatable across the two settings. That is, we can specify exactly the same reason relations of implication and incompatibility while moving systematically between the modalized state spaces of truthmaker semantics and implicational phase space semantics. Here's a gesture as to how to do it. For one direction, if you begin with any truthmaker model, one can define a corresponding implicational phase space, one that corresponds to it in the sense of defining exactly the same implications and incompatibilities. We're given a truthmaker model of a language L0 defined on a modalized state space that has the state space S, the distinguished subspace of it, S diamond, and the fusion operation, which assigns to each sentence A of the language a pair of sets of states, the verifiers and the falsifiers of the sentence. The points of the implicational phase space being defined are ordered pairs of sets of sentences of L0. These are the candidate implications. And what corresponds to fusion is just adjunction, as usually defined in implicational phase space semantics. It remains to compute I0, the set of good implications. And we can do that using the consequence relation that Lobel defined to mimic the Rest-All-Ripley bilateral understanding of the multi-succedent turnstile. That is, the ordered pair of gamma and delta is a good implication, just in case the fusion of any state S that verifies all of gamma and any state T that falsifies all of delta is an impossible state in the truthmaker model. This construction obviously guarantees that exactly the same implications will hold in the implicational phase space, that is, be elements of I0, as satisfy the Lobel consequence relation in the truthmaker model. So there's a straightforward method for taking any truthmaker model defined on a modalized state space and defining from it an implicational phase space model that has exactly the same reason relations of implication and incompatibility. And it turns out that one can also go in the other direction. Beginning with an implicational phase space, one can define a truthmaker model, an interpreted modalized state space, that corresponds to it in the sense of defining exactly the same implications and incompatibilities. I won't go through the details here. Here's just an indication. For various meta-theoretic purposes, Fine employs what he calls canonical truth-making models, in which the verifier of a logically atomic sentence is just that sentence, and the falsifier of that sentence is just the negation of the sentence. His requirement that the fusion of any verifiers of A will be a verifier of A, and the fusion of any falsifiers of A will also be a falsifier of A, is then trivially satisfied because there's only one. We can combine that idea with Dan Kaplan's standard representation of a proposition expressed by the pair of A and the empty set and the empty set and A, and do without the formation of falsifying literals by defining the verifiers of A as just the implication A empty set and the falsifiers as just empty set A. I show how to work this all out in the paper that's in the Dropbox. I'm not going to go through it. The result is a straightforward uniform translation between Dan Kaplan's implicational phase state semantics and Fine's truthmaker semantics. Each truthmaker model on a language corresponds to an implicational phase space defined on that same language in the sense that they underwrite exactly the same reason relations of implication and incompatibility. This translation shows how Fine's truthmaker semantics can be deflated from the point of view of semantic inferentialism. For it shows how to extract what the inferentialist insists is its semantic core, the way it functions to codify reason relations of implication and incompatibility that articulate claimable, so propositional contents. The representational metaphysical reading of what Fine calls truth-making states is, from this perspective, optional and inessential. It's at best a harmless indulgence, and at worst, a misleading characterization of the semantic enterprise. So, in conclusion, I've sketched an order of explanation that moves from pragmatics to semantics. The most basic use of linguistic expressions is to perform speech acts of assertion and denial, manifesting doxastic attitudes of accepting and rejecting. I claim that what makes the practical attitudes doxastic attitudes, and so makes the locutions that express them declarative sentences, is their standing liability to challenges by assertions that provide reasons against them, and the consequent obligation to defend them by assertions that provide reasons for them. Those dialogic practices make intelligible reason relations of implication and incompatibility, which can be understood in terms of normative statuses of commitment to accept and reject, and preclusion of entitlement to such commitments. The second stage of the envisaged pragmatics first order of explanation then semantically characterizes the claimable contents expressed by the declarative sentences that are asserted or denied, what can be doxastically accepted or rejected, in terms of the functional roles those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. This is what I meant by saying that the reason relations mediate between the pragmatics and the semantics. Dan Kaplan's substructural implicational phase space semantics shows in detail how an expressively powerful formal semantics can be elaborated from the material relations of implication and incompatibility that precipitate out of the functionalist story told in such a normative, pragmatic metavocabulary. That's the principal story I want to put on the table. But an exciting recent result of Ulf Lobel's shows that Kit finds truthmaker semantics stands in surprising relations of isomorphism to the normative pragmatics gestured at here. And I build on that result to show that it also stands in surprising relations to Dan Kaplan's inferentialist semantics. As a secondary project, I've sketched how those results can be used to facilitate the comparison of a pragmatics first order of explanation with the most sophisticated contemporary development of the semantics first order of explanation. For we see first that the pragmatic significance of relations of implication and incompatibility defined in truthmaker terms can be articulated in bilateralist terms of the Restall-Ripley sort, and by extension in terms of normative statuses of commitment and entitlement that I've suggested here as a way of sharpening their account. This new way of building a pragmatics on top of truthmaker semantics marks a fault line, or at least a division of labor within the truthmaker setting. On one side, there's the metaphysical story about states, about their mereological fusion, and about the division of them into possible and impossible. On the other side, there are reason relations of implication and incompatibility that Lobel shows how to define on that basis. The pragmatic connection to discursive practices of defending and challenging doxastic attitudes of acceptance and rejection depends only on the latter, that is, on the reason relations. That's the only part of the truthmaker semantic story that shows up as pragmatically significant. To show that the metaphysics matters, or further, is even implicit in the use of expressions to whose meaning it purports to contribute, some further pragmatic story would have to be told, going beyond the one envisaged here. The only part of the truthmaker semantics that's pragmatically significant is the reason relation it determines, and those we can specify without the metaphysical commitments. So we saw that the meaning relations of implication and incompatibility generated by the heavily metaphysically committive truthmaker semantics can be reproduced exactly within the much less metaphysically committive implicational phase space semantics, all of whose primitives can be understood as implicit in the pragmatics that specifies the use of expressions in discursive practice. So a space is opened up for a deflated version of the truthmaker semantics. The claim here would be that the commutative monoid that does the heavy lifting in truthmaker semantics has been mischaracterized, needlessly and misleadingly encrusted with functionally irrelevant Baroque metaphysical ornamentation. Underneath that misleading guise, what's doing the work is Dan Kaplan's operator adjoining premises and conclusions of implications to mark their ranges of subjunctive robustness. Thank you.
About 15 minutes for questions. A reminder, if you're joining us via Zoom, if you have a question, please just type Q in the chat, and I'll try to go back and forth between the live audience and the Zoom audience. Oh, okay. You want to unpin him or?
Yeah, I suppose.
Jaakko, please.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
I can, yeah.
Yes, well, my question concerns, or maybe goes a little off from the focus of your topic, but it concerns conceptual realism as an independent metaphysical theory. So I'm interested to know if one of the conclusions of the idea that the world itself is conceptually structured is that there can be no reality, no patch of reality, which is not in thinkable form for some rational creature. And then the worry that sort of raises from this is that there becomes because it seems sort of very highly improbable that all of reality would have to be such that some rational being can think of it, or that it seems like a huge coincidence then, or so I would be interested to know if there is indeed such a tight connection then between what is real and what is thinkable in this view.
Well, that's the claim, and I believe it. It comes from an analysis of what it is to be a determinate state of affairs, what it is for the world to be a totality of facts. And the claim is that that notion is the very notion of things being thus and so, things being one way rather than another, is intelligible only in a context in which possible ways things can be stand in relations of modally strong exclusion to one another. That is, some ways things can be exclude other ways things can be, and necessitate still others, have others as their consequences. That is, it's the view that the notion of a determinate world is the notion of a law-governed world, one that is modally robust in the sense of including relations of incompatibility and consequence. What's remarkable to my mind about, well, on the one hand, Hegel's view, but I only mentioned Hegel in passing here, we see the same thing here. Whatever the truth makers and false makers are, however you think of the states of the world, that is conceptual structure. To talk about those, to be a modal realist is to be a conceptual realist in this sense. And that notion of conceptual articulation in terms of relations of incompatibility and consequence owes nothing to the conceptual activity of any beings. So it may well be that there are not and never will be rational beings whose language sufficiently cuts at the joints that it incorporates all the incompatibilities and consequences that there are, but there's none of it, no bit of it, that in principle exceeds our capacity. Any particular relations of incompatibility and consequence we can codify, though maybe not all of them together.
Okay, can I have one quick follow-up? So I take the silence as a yes. So
go ahead.
Okay, so you would deny that, or you would then claim that it is incoherent to have a thought that there could be something real, some fact, which no rational creature could think about in principle. So that there would be some kind of an incoherence there.
Right. I think one would need to give such a thought a content. It doesn't come with one as I'm reconstructing what thinkability, intelligibility is.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Bob. It's Dave Beisecker here.
Hi, Dave.
Hi there. So I have a question about the scope of assertion and denial versus the scope of statements that fall under acceptance and rejection. Because it strikes me that the scope of statements that you can accept and reject run far beyond just declarative sentences. And that's why you can unify the Restall and Ripley account of validity with, say, imperative logic and make sense of imperative disjunctive syllogism, imperative modus ponens, and imperative modus tollens. So just sort of the invitation for you to talk about the scope of acceptance and rejection and how that relates to assertion and denial.
Okay, I'm down with all of that, but it's all, from my point of view, conceptually and so explanatorily downstream from getting the declarative sentences right. So we're going to understand other uses, imperatives, erratics, questions. We're going to understand those as essentially semantically dependent on declarative sentences. So the distinction between an imperative, the pragmatic distinction between an imperative and a mere call whose appropriate response is to do one kind of thing rather than another, the sort of thing Wittgenstein describes in the slab language game at the beginning of the investigations. He calls those commands slab roof calls rather than imperatives, because they are just noises that it's appropriate to respond to by bringing a slab or something else. A true imperative is that, it has that pragmatic significance, but it also determines what the appropriate response is by saying what it is, by describing what you have to make true in order to satisfy the imperative, bring me a slab. You can't have that imperative unless you're in a context where you have the declarative sentence, this is a slab. And I would say the same thing about questions, thought of semantically, the way Belknap does is in terms of the set of responsive answers to them. So I agree, we're going to want to build on this story, a much more pragmatically articulated story, but this is where it has to start. And that's true even if the light dawns slowly over the whole and the practice as it grows up has to include not only declarative sentences, but also imperatives and questions, let's say. Nonetheless, to be a discursive practice, it's got to have that declarative core. And that's what I'm appealing to and interpreting here.
If we're quick, I think we can fit in the two questions that we have left, Preston and Ulf.
So, hi, Bob. Can you see me over here?
Yes, you're tiny, but I can see.
All right. Well, that's fitting. So I want to ask, I think it's really interesting that there's all this stuff on bilateralism that seems to have come out. I mean, it's in Lazzo's book. Dave's been harping at it for years now. Caterina Dutil-Nove's stuff on the prover and skeptic model of deduction. And I want to push you. I guess I'm curious why, for your purposes, you're focused on the Restall stuff at the level of the turnstile, where you've got assertions and rejection, where it seems to me what's interesting for the kind of stuff you're doing, seeing logic as making explicit practices of reasoning, what's really interesting is not at the level of the turnstile, but rather at the level of the conditional and negation. So the bilateralist truth trees decomposes the conditional in terms of being precluded from asserting the antecedent and denying the consequent. And then the assertion of a negation is preclusion from denying, or it's negating it's denying the negate. So that's a way of accounting for grasp of logically complex sentences in terms of practices, attitudes of assertion and denial. Why isn't that where you're going?
Well, I mean, it is. That's both where we're going and where we came from. The margin of this talk was too small to contain the logical portion of it, but the bulk of Dan Kaplan's work in the implicational phase-space semantics has been to show how to give sound and complete semantics for the variety of principally non-monotonic logics that we care about. And you can do that in these terms. And the reason I focus on the turnstile and even use it to codify not only implication, but incompatibility, using an empty right-hand side, is that sequent calculus, multi-successant sequent calculus formulation is the one that most directly works and plays well with the implicational phase space semantics. So indeed, the reason for all of the otherwise pointless subscripts 0 on the L and the I and so on is because the next phase is to extend the language from a logically atomic language to one that includes paradigmatically conditionals and negation, and then extend the implicational phase space semantics to the new logically complex language. And of course, we're particularly interested there in introducing modal vocabulary to codify explicitly in the logically extended object language the ranges of subjunctive robustness that are doing the semantic heavy lifting in the implicational phase space semantics. So absolutely, logic is where this is going.
Hi, Bob. Here's Ulf, and I hope it's not too frivolous to ask your question stuff that is so closely connected to my own thought. But anyway, one question I have is, so there's a traditional worry about inferentialism that there are too many models around that could, that give you the same consequence relation. So that you don't pin down the extensions just by pinning down the consequence relation. And I think this still applies. And in this, what you talked about today, one could be worried about how, so you say that you can always construct, and it's true, that you can always construct a phase space, a truth maker model from, so a modalized state space from a phase space, from one of Dan's phase spaces. But of course, one might think, well, there might be many you can construct in this way, right? You might be able to assign truth makers and false makers in many ways and still get the same consequence relation. And you might think that only one of those is the intended one. One of those is the one that actually pins the consequence relation in the right way to reality. My question is, do you have any thoughts on if this is necessary or even possible? And I think it connects to some of the things that Dave said about imperatives, because you might think that one traditional way of doing this for inferentialists is, of course, to start talking about language entry and exit moves, but they didn't come up. And I'm wondering whether you need them at some point in the translation from the phase space into the truth maker models.
Okay, well, I mean, you're putting your finger characteristically on just the important point. There is a fault line, or anyway, a division of labor marked within the truth maker semantics by these results that say, look, what determines the relations of implication and incompatibility is just the structure of this commutative monoid that you've got. And those come cheap. We can reconstruct those in much more metaphysically spare terms. And yes, where we can build one of them, we could build others of them. It's part of Fine's vision that there's more to metaphysics than that part of the semantics. You're articulating that intuition on his behalf. That's what we should be arguing about. My claim was that if we just look at the spare normative pragmatics that I described, all of that machinery is odious. It's not needed to determine the reason relations that are what gets manifested in the kind of dialogue of challenge and defense that I was talking about. And I think in the fullness of time, it will turn out that reason relations that are definable in terms of those merely dialogical situations without the language entries and exits are indeed too abstract and too multiply realizable to do all the semantic work that we want to do. So, I envisage a kind of triangulation that would require us to enrich the picture to include entries and exits, and so to disambiguate the conceptual contents in a way that would make them have the right truth makers and false makers sort of metaphysically. But I don't actually know how to do that in detail. That's an aspiration.
Let's thank our speaker again. We will now take a 7-minute break.